without a sharp course correction, we don't have any reason to expect the United States to exist a generation from now. At this point, I don't even think that the continuation of liberalism looks like a viable alternative to people who look at this objectively.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. We've got a lot to talk about and a fascinating interview with author Yoram Hazony to get to. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video, subscribe to JNS, hit the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. Now, if, like most people, you don't follow the world of political and intellectual ideas closely, you missed it. 3 years ago, a debate between two conservative writers turned into the kind of no-holds-barred brawl that drew in many other writers and even garnered attention from liberal journals like The New Yorker. But while many observers decried the back and forth between David French and Sohrab Ahmari as reflecting the decline of civility in American public discourse, the substance of their disagreement was important. With radical ideologies and intolerant woke culture taking a crowbar to traditional values and even the foundations of Western civilization, what should the proper response be? Do we keep faith with classical liberalism and maintain an attitude of live and let live even when we see disturbing trends gaining traction and driving opponents out of the mainstream? Or do we reject the idea of a neutral public square and instead answer wokeness with a counteroffensive rooted in tradition and religion that would not tolerate those forces seeking to tear down our institutions and civic culture? The pretext for this Donnybrook was a news item about a drag queen story hour being held in a public library in Sacramento, California. For Ahmari, then the op-ed editor at the New York Post and now the editor of Compact, a new magazine he recently founded, the deliberate exposure of young children to cross-dressing risque dancers was a disaster that required more than a shrug of the shoulders. He thought that the problem was that conservatives were so devoted to individual rights that they failed to see what was at stake. He said that advocates of radical ideas about race, sexual or gender identity indoctrination weren't interested in merely defending their autonomy to do as they like in private spaces. They required everyone else to positively affirm their choices and ideas, and that imperative, backed up by liberal political forces who practiced intolerance for dissent in the name of tolerance, would inevitably drive anyone who didn't agree out of the public square. That is what happened with religious dissenters from practices like gay marriage, which is now widely accepted across society, and what also inevitably happened to those who felt drag queen story hour and even worse ideas were inappropriate. Ahmari placed the blame for this complacency on David French, a lawyer who defends conservatives in religious liberty cases, and then also a writer for National Review magazine. In an essay published in the First Things magazine titled Against David Frenchism, Ahmari said it was the willingness of people like French to argue only for a public square in which everyone could do as they liked that had stripped society of its defenses. The classical liberal values of individual liberty at the core of conservative political ideas in the late 20th and early 21st centuries was, Ahmari said, a failure because it was too weak and too tolerant to fight for what its adherents believed in. In response, French, who is today a senior editor at the never-Trump journal The Dispatch, denounced Ahmari's call for an offensive against the woke as a threat to everyone's liberty. If the right could ban drag queens from libraries, what would stop the left from doing the same to conservative Christians and Orthodox Jews? To his way of thinking, even things that he opposed were the blessings of liberty. It was the duty of conservatives to defend free discourse, not to suppress it. Part of the subtext of this argument was that French was a fierce critic of former President Donald Trump. Amari had moved from opposition to support of Trump once he was in office. Amari's notion that the right had to stop playing nice with intolerant leftists tapped into the same feelings that drove many voters to embrace Trump. A lot has happened in the 3 years since this dust-up, and events have strengthened Amari's argument in the eyes of many on the right. The Black Lives Matter riots, the willingness of many in the media, academia, and public education to adopt the false narrative about American history promoted by the New York Times 1619 Project, the embrace by many of the same institutions of critical race theory, white privilege, intersectionality, the acceptance of intolerant and racist diversity, equity, and inclusion agendas, and the spread of gender indoctrination, even for very young children, has created a genuine cultural crisis. Indeed, the pretext for the Amari-French debate has gone mainstream. The drive to foster acceptance of those who identify as transgender has led to intolerance of dissenting views. Those opposing the practice of allowing life-altering surgeries and treatments for children who claim to be experiencing gender dysphoria are branded as bigots by the Biden administration. And yes, drag queen appearances at not just libraries, but in public schools have been normalized by those who see it as necessary to promote inclusion. Indeed, when Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel recently quipped that she thought the battle for LGBTQ acceptance may require a drag queen for every school, Amari did something of a touchdown dance over French and other critics. His predictions that their tolerance of that which ought not to be tolerated would lead to those who oppose such practices being the ones being driven out of the public square was seemingly vindicated. This is the context for the publication of a new book, which takes this debate to a different and higher level. In his Conservatism, a Rediscovery, Yoram Hazony argues that liberalism and liberal values are being destroyed by woke radicals, who have seized control of much of our popular culture and even our political system. He says the only possible way to oppose this trend is to discard a classical liberal approach that has proven incapable of defending itself. In its place, he advocates for a system of conservative democracy that would balance belief in individual rights with the needs of the nation and society. What he wants is the triumph of a conservatism rooted in ideas of nationalism, faith, and tradition that are, he believes, the only effective answers to the woke Marxists who are in the process of storming and capturing society and turning their ideas into a state religion. Though in his book, Hazony takes up the cudgels for the Anglo-American conservative tradition, he has been a formidable intellectual force in the Jewish world. Born in Israel, though raised and educated in the United States, Hazony founded the influential Shalom Center think tank in Jerusalem and then helped lead the way to it becoming Shalom College, Israel's first liberal arts college. Since leaving Shalom, he has taken on different projects, including the presidency of the Herzl Institute and becoming chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation, named in honor of the 18th century English thinker and politician, whose ideas are at the core of his philosophy. Much of the book is an exercise in intellectual history. He traces the history of Anglo-American conservatism back to its early English roots and also provides a triptych through the work of the writers and thinkers who shaped modern American conservative thought. At its core is a critique of rationalist ideas that are based on abstract concepts, as opposed to those that are empirical, that are derived from experience and integrated international traditions. This may be heavy going for readers who are not interested in political philosophy, but Hazony's template for what a conservative democracy would entail is more worthy of widespread debate than the Amari French spat. The most accessible selection of the book is its concluding passages, in which Hazony speaks of what it means to live a conservative life. In tracing his own story of meeting the woman he would marry in college And their subsequent journey toward a life based on religious belief, while exploring the world of conservative ideas, provides an instructive model for how to live your principles. His belief that you can't credibly extol traditional values in public while flouting them at home makes sense. As for policy, he extols a blueprint for society that would be based on reverence for national identity, embrace of public religion, the rule of law, the notion of the traditional family, and the religious congregation as the basis of civilized life and education that would be influenced by religion. He backs economic freedom, but unlike prevalent conservative trends of the last generation, which venerated the free market above all other values, he supports a more common good conservatism, which would balance the needs of the nation and its people against unfettered capitalism. He thinks immigration rights should be tempered by the necessity of integrating migrants into the national culture and cohesion of each country. His defense of nationalism as a virtue in of itself, the subject of a previous book, and his opposition to multilateralism and international bodies is similarly based on the experience of what destructive institutions like the United Nations have done. Some of this is controversial, especially for Jewish readers. His support for the role of religion in public life goes beyond opposition to a high wall of separation between church and state, to support for the notion that Christianity should be the basis for public life and strongly reflected in government, in nations like the United States where there is a Christian majority, albeit with provisions being made for Jews and other minorities to ensure their right to practice their beliefs. That sounds like the establishment of Christianity as a state religion, something the Founding Fathers rejected with good reason, as well as a shift in status from full equality to toleration for Jews. While that might be defensible in nations that are based on specific ethnic or religious groups, like, for example, Israel, which is and has the right to be an avowedly Jewish state, or other nations with Christian, Muslim, or other national cultures, that's a non-starter for the United States. Nor is it clear how the enshrinement of the traditional family as the norm, while laudable in principle, can be compatible with the belief in equality for different versions of family life. While these are weaknesses in Hazony's argument, these questions also point out the difficult dilemma society faces. If acceptance of non-traditional practices inevitably leads to intolerance for traditional religion and culture, how do those who value tradition and the Western canon, but also venerate individual liberty as the only proper purpose of government, defend what we hold dear? The woke threat to society and democracy that this book seeks to answer is no passing fad. In spite of misgivings about some of the elements of his vision of conservative democracy, we need more books like Hazony's and a vigorous debate about them and their ideas. Without it, we will remain at the mercy of forces whose objective is not just to strip the public square of faith and to drive traditional values and their adherents to the margins of society, but also to ultimately crush any idea of liberty or democracy. And now to our interview of the week. This week, we're thrilled to have with us the author of Conservatism, Yoram Hazony. Yoram Hazony, welcome to Top Story.
Good to see you again, Jonathan. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you with us. You've written what I think is really an important book, and it's coming, I think, at a very important time because of what you write about and what it appears to be sort of an immoral emergency in our society and sort of the crisis of classical liberalism, with traditional institutions no longer being seemingly able to defend themselves against sort of woke Marxism and cancel culture and sort of so many toxic ideologies in our lives. And I think the context that I'm thinking of this week is that of a dust-up within the conservative intellectual world that took place 3 years ago between two people that both of us know, Sohrab Ahmari and David French, about, of all things, a drag queen story hour at a library. That was like a major argument at the time, But 3 years later, I don't think it's quite as possible as many people did at the time to dismiss it, because after Black Lives Matter riots, the rise of critical race theory, gender indoctrination, even for small children in schools, and intersectionality, we've come to a point where it's no longer possible to deny this, and sort of there's a coda to that argument, I think, because in the last week, and our friend Sorab was sort of doing a touchdown dance over this. The Attorney General of Michigan said that we needed a drag queen in every school, which sort of shows how our institutions have been infiltrated. Now, and that perhaps classical liberalism isn't an effective answer to it. Now, you went much deeper into this than that little argument went in your book, and you've written something that's sort of part intellectual history, part polemic, part lifestyle guide. When you began writing this, I'm not sure all of this was as obvious, certainly to the rest of us, perhaps to you, but what led you to believe that it was time for what you describe as conservative democracy and a time for a conservative revival, even at a time when there's so much conservative thought out there?
Well, I think the place to start is I think we all need to get onto the same page about, if possible, about what happened in the year 2020 and why that was such a crucial watershed year for American democracy and for democracy throughout the Western world. Since the two world wars, after the Second World War, there was a kind of a traumatic reaction that led to the establishment of what eventually came to be called liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is, people today think it's an old phrase. It's actually a very new phrase that was coined between the two world wars. And what liberal democracy claims to describe is probably a better way to think about it might be Enlightenment liberalism, is a political worldview that says that you don't need government, you don't need the state to be involved in doing anything other than protecting the liberties and equality of individuals which belong to them by nature. I mean, everybody should recognize this. I mean, I think we all started learning it in high school, if not in elementary school. The premise that we're all created free and equal, the premise that human beings don't have any obligations pretty much other than those that they accept upon themselves by consent, and also the idea that human beings are fundamentally reasonable, and that if you allow people to argue and debate freely, then everybody will come to some kind of basic conclusion that looks a lot like leave everybody else alone and let them do their thing, and everything will be fine. So let's call, in the book I call this Enlightenment liberalism. It's a term lots of other people use, and that Enlightenment liberalism succeeded in lasting as the dominant worldview, animating in different versions both the Democratic Party and the Republicans in the United States, and likewise most major political parties in Britain and across Europe for 2 generations. So now it's 60 or 70 years later, and Christianity and the idea of public religion, the idea of a Bible-based society, any kind of national and religious traditions have been for 60 or 70 years privatized and turned into something that should only concern private individuals. And so we did the experiment, and along comes 2020. And almost all of the great liberal institutions that we're familiar with, from the New York Times to Princeton University, over the course of 1 or 2 years, suddenly proved themselves incapable of continuing to maintain this liberal tradition, the tradition of liberalism post World War II, and instead have accommodated and given into a tide of what we could call woke neo-Marxism. People use different names to call us, but we all know what we're talking about: the critical race theory and the critical gender theory. It's an ongoing cultural revolution, which has proved that it will not stop until it destroys every inherited way of thinking, way of behaving, and institution that we've received from the past. And that's the immediate cause for my book. These are things that I've believed for a long time, but I do feel that after 2020, I think if people don't get it now, then they're never going to get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You, in your book, you trace the roots of this argument about the importance of tradition and faith, which you see as key to preserving society and to defending our institutions, back to a number of Anglo-American writers and thinkers. What is it that you think makes the works of conservative English thinkers, people like Edmund Burke, as well as the framers of the U.S. Constitution, speak so loudly to our contemporary problems? Because you're sort of tracing back, and you want us to rediscover what they understood and what seemingly we have lost.
Sure. What they have in common, the great English common lawyers leading up to Edmund Burke, and then the American Federalist Party, which was kind of the nationalist conservative party at the American founding, Washington, John Jay, Adams, Hamilton, and Gouverneur Morris and their friends. What unites them is a view that the English Constitution is fundamentally, or a variant of it is fundamentally the best constitution that ever existed. These are Adams in 1787 wrote an entire book explaining that why the English Constitution is the best constitution that there ever was in human history. And he argued that the reason that the American constitutional tradition, he's not just talking about the Constitution of 1787, but also the constitutions of the American states before the Revolution. And he says what makes these constitutions so successful, so worthy, both in terms of their stability and their capacity to grant freedom and order while protecting traditions. What makes all of that possible is that the Americans inherited a traditional constitution from the English, which had developed over many centuries, and there was at the American founding a party that opposed this idea. So Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine, you can name others, but Jefferson is really the most radical of them. He argued explicitly time and again that there's no need for any traditional constitution, that reason is sufficient. And in fact, he opposed the American Constitution of 1787. And his argument was that really Americans should just get together every 20 years and invent an entirely new constitution. He argues that each generation should regard itself as a foreign country, he says, with respect to the preceding generations. And there you see in the argument between Jefferson and Washington's party, the Federalists, or in the argument between Edmund Burke and Tom Paine, it's the same argument. The question of whether reason is sufficient, or whether human beings are fundamentally traditional creatures, and if we don't have traditions to uphold us and guide us, then we'll lose our way very quickly.
Well, I think that makes that sort of makes explicable in some ways, as you say, what we've been seeing in the last 3 years, since 2020 especially, with the tearing down of statues, the tearing down of traditional institutions. Basically, the idea that in our new woke selves, the woke sensibilities, that everything that went before, our understandings of American history, such as the sort of fallacious 1619 project put forward by the New York Times, which is gaining traction in many public school systems, that we're sort of like Jefferson reinventing ourselves, but there's a cost to this, isn't there? And I think that's something that you're pointing to, that that if we discard everything, that basically anything is then possible.
Yeah, I think it's not just that anything is possible, but all options become equal, and when all options are equal, then those that are actually healthy and good become extremely difficult for most people to determine. I mean, most of us simply do not have the ability, and I know this is a difficult conclusion to come to, but most of us simply do not have the ability to invent from scratch a worldview, a moral worldview, a political worldview, and understanding how to live. And the way that human beings are constructed is that we do search for the truth, and we do search for justice, and those things are important. But the way that we do it is as part of an inherited tradition, and the two traditions that I've spent most of my life studying. One is the Jewish biblical and rabbinic tradition, and the other that we're talking about in this book is the Anglo-American conservative tradition. So the Jewish tradition is about 3,000 years old, and the Anglo-American tradition, which originally saw itself as being derived from the Bible, from the biblical tradition, that Anglo-American tradition is about 1,000 years old. And in both cases, I think it's, we can all agree that along with great conservative thinkers like John Selden and Edmund Burke, that the tradition doesn't come down to us flawless. We don't receive it as a perfect thing. Every tradition, picks up some things along the way that make you uncomfortable, or that are actually harmful enough so that change is necessary. So all conservatives agree that sometimes change is necessary, but the fundamental posture that made it possible for both of these astonishing great traditions to perpetuate themselves, to be conserved and transmitted over thousands of years, is a posture that assumes that conservation and transmission is the absolute heart of a proper political and moral worldview. And that, I think, is what we gave up after the Second World War. We all everybody kind of became Jeffersonians and said, look, we don't need these inherited traditions, because what do? I mean, all they do is they bring us persecution of blacks and inequalities between Jews and Christians. I mean, you know the list. And but that decision to say we don't need inherited traditions because they have flaws in them, that turns out to have been a terrible mistake.
And it's interesting to me because I think you're, on the one hand, making a very broad, very, very strong critique of sort of Enlightenment liberalism and rationalism, as traced back to the Enlightenment thinkers, people like Jefferson. And you're also making in this book a pretty strong criticism of where the conservative movement itself in this country, the modern conservatism, went in post-World War II America. Because Jefferson, as much as Jefferson and Hamilton, the great rivals, people care about Hamilton since that musical that came out on Broadway, right. Which is a fascinating thing. That was the musical that saved the $10 bill.
Right.
But it's also that the right in this country had sort of taken up a lot of what Jefferson believed in that sort of the libertarian bent that is part of that tradition. And that, a conservative icon, a great conservative leader like Ronald Reagan would always speak of, that was a standard joke that the most scary words in the English language is that I'm from the government and I've come to help you. And the suspicion of government, the suspicion of anything outside of defending personal liberty. Now, I don't believe that you're not critiquing the idea of defending personal liberty, but I think the point you're trying to make in the book is that merely defending personal liberty, elevating liberty and the autonomy of the individual to our highest and maybe only value, is not only wrong because it contradicts the needs to sort of build up society from the point of view of tradition and religion, but also that it renders us defenseless against, as you say, the woke Marxists who are have a critique that for which classical liberalism doesn't seem to have an answer.
Well, classical liberals have an answer. I mean, they know that they have their arguments against the Marxists and against the fascists and against the conservatives. They know their arguments. I mean, I think we're all familiar with them. The problem is that in politics and in morals, an argument can't just be right in some sort of theoretical abstract sense. Your views also have to be able to perpetuate themselves. Right? Liberalism is it's properly named. It's a worldview that is fundamentally based on the view that the important thing, as you say, the supreme thing is the freedom of the individual. And conservatism approaches things from a different perspective and says, if your freedoms are simply destroying the society that you want to bequeath to your children and your grandchildren, so those freedoms have gone too far. That's, as you say, it's not an anti-liberal. It's not an anti-liberty position. I think it's a view that says, look, there is no one supreme good in politics. There are lots of things that you need in politics. This is the traditional Anglo-American conservative view that if you want liberty, then you have to have many other things, and those things include, for example, a cohesive society, right? Something liberals never talk about, but conservatives talk about a lot. What's a cohesive society? A cohesive society is one that's characterized by a willingness for the different members of the society, the different individuals, but also the different groups and tribes, to come together in times of difficulty, to give honor to one another, to be loyal to one another, and to struggle on behalf of a common cause. And that is, in fact, if you read the preamble to the American Constitution written by Gouverneur Morris, it has 7 purposes of government there. And the very first purpose of government, he says, is to form a more perfect union. That claim that a more perfect union is a purpose of government, that it's inherently necessary. It's not just like some optional thing. Is something that today I think is quite shocking to a lot of people who call themselves conservatives, and they say, "Oh, that sounds authoritarian," but it's right there. It's the first purpose of American government as the Federalists understood it. And I think you're right. I think that during the 1960s, for all sorts of reasons that you can say are good reasons, the coalition that William F. Buckley Jr. Assembled under the name of conservatism during the Cold War, it focused overwhelmingly on the liberty of individual. In fact, I think the best way to describe that 1960s fusionism is that it was an attempted fusion of liberalism and conservatism, of anti-Marxist liberalism with conservatism. And there were reasons for that, good reasons. The reason was that Buckley and his colleagues were looking for a way to defeat a rising communism overseas and a rapidly rising socialism at home. And the way to fight it, they decided, was this overwhelming emphasis on the liberty of the individual above all things. And certainly good things came out of it. That Cold War conservatism with its overwhelming emphasis on public liberalism or libertarianism, it defeated the Soviet Union. It rolled back socialism in American Britain for an entire generation. And my friends and I, when we were in college, we joined the Reagan Thatcher movement, and we were wholeheartedly in support of that. But I think people tend to forget that that the Reagan moment, and this was true of Thatcher also, that the Reagan Thatcher moment was not exclusively about the liberty of the individual. There are plenty of good quotes from Reagan and Thatcher because they were fighting communism and they were emphasizing that. But the conservatism that of the 1980s, most of its significant thinkers, I think, if you think about Irving Kristol or where George Will was in those days, or the religious parts of the Reagan movement, Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell, and many others who described the Anglo-American conservatism in the 1980s as I'll quote Irving Kristol, as being based on three pillars. Irving Kristol said the three pillars are religion, nationalism, and economic growth. And for Irving, religion was the most important of them. And he already in the 1980s was actually earlier was explicit that the loss of religion and the family and national traditions and congregational membership and traditional ways of life, that the loss of that would mean that that the freedom of the market would end up dominating every sphere of human life. And Irving was very forceful about this. He has a famous essay in which he argued for censorship against pornography, which was still, pornography, with uncensored pornography, was still a very new thing in the United States when he was writing it. It also comes from the 1960s. And Irving goes very far. I mean, he says explicitly in Reflections of a Neoconservative, his book from 1983, that a society that is not capable of protecting people against pornography, a society that is, in his words, squalid and debased, and incapable of lifting human beings up above the level of animals, he called that idolatry. He said that such a society is not worthy of governing itself. So those are extremely forceful terms that he used, a generation earlier, before Sohrab Ahmari's campaign, justified campaign against Drag Queen's Story Hour. Irving Kristol was saying, America, as a nation, as an independent nation, does not have a right to exist if it's going to be based on this kind of corruption and immorality. It's sort of amazing, but that's the conservatism that I and my friends joined and became a part of in the 1980s.
And that kind of got lost, I guess, in the last quarter century, as conservatism became much more about, at least up until 2016 and Trump, became very much about the free market and outsourcing and sort of other people's the other people's money kind of approach to the free market, and there was a great disconnect, I think, between a lot of the voters who wanted to defend what they thought of as their traditions, their ideas about how society should be. And that sort of created this sort of disconnect between conservative elites, between establishment elites, no matter where you stand, and people who want to preserve society, who are actually where Irving Kristol perhaps was 40 years ago.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize that when we speak about preserving society, because that's a phrase that we all use very frequently, and we're kind of used to think we're kind of used to thinking, oh well, society's going to get along, one way or another. So it'll be, so it'll be a little bit worse, a little bit better. But I think people can begin understanding now that that's not what we're facing. That the arguments of Irving Kristol or of Alan Bloom is another good example from the 1980s. They meant it seriously. They meant you could really lose this country. They meant that it could become so dissolved and decadent that it would end up crumbling into civil war or foreign influence and conquest of the country. I mean, these were very radical things to be saying at a time when America was extremely strong, extremely united compared to what there is now, a very traditionalist society compared to what there is now, and they saw where it was going, and now we're here. I mean, now we've actually gotten to the point where I think I think most people can understand that without a sharp course correction, we don't have any reason to expect the United States to exist a generation from now.
And, at least the United States that some of us grew up in.
Well, the United States that we grew up in is, I think, exists only in certain pockets in the country, and that's part of my argument in the book is that those pockets those pockets are extremely important, because a lot of young people come to me and say that, look, what are you talking about? How can we conserve any traditions? The traditions are gone. I didn't inherit anything of use from my parents. I can't tell you how often I hear that. And those questions from people who are 25 years old or 30 years old, those questions have to be well taken. We're very far along the road of having said, just think for yourself. We don't need traditions really for anything. And if we want to turn this around, if we want anything from the American political, religious, and cultural inheritance that's of any worth, that's going to require not just some kind of legislative agenda that's going to vote certain curriculum in and out of the schools. The problem is much deeper than that. I don't think you can have a conservative government where you don't have conservative people leading a conservative life. And conservative life is not something you can get out of books. I mean, but the books are important, the ideas are important, but the main point is that if you're a young person and the way you live is that your parents always told you, just do whatever is good for you, and you're free to be you and me, and they move away from their parents when they're 18 years old, and then basically become free atoms. They can be 35 years old, still not married, still not having children, still thinking, oh, it doesn't really make any difference whether I serve in the military or whether I go to church or to synagogue. All of these things just make no difference. A person like that is not somebody who is capable of understanding what it is to conserve and transmit things. A person like that can't actually take part in a conservative revival of the United States or of Britain or of any other country. Because if you live as a liberal and all of your thoughts, the thoughts that lead to actions are liberal thoughts only about your personal freedom and how uncomfortable it would be to recognize and uphold duties and responsibilities to your family or to your nation. If that's who you are, there's not going to be a conservative political revival based on people like that. So the book is in part about public conservatism, but I think an important part is that people have to do what we Jews call tshuva. Tshuva means repentance. It means going back and finding the tradition that you've lost. That involves going to at this point Orthodox Christian or Jewish communities, congregations are the very few places that are left that are still transmitting and conserving anything. You need to plug yourself back into that and learn how to conserve and transmit, or there's just not going to be anything left.
Yeah, I think that's, you kind of got to the element, the key, the core of this problem, because in an era where sort of everything is on the internet and everything, we sort of, everything goes, no holds barred. There are no limits on anything except sort of what, sort of totalitarian elements within, sort of our government or corporate establishment wishes to suppress, which is usually more traditionalist ideas. It's very hard, to make the case to young people or to anyone that a revival of the values that, you're speaking of is possible, because, religion is in such decline, because traditional values are so commonly flouted in a way. I mean, Andrew Breitbart talked about how politics is downstream of culture. Culture, the popular culture in this country and around the world has legitimized things that traditional religion and sort of the ethics of the fathers would have would have regarded as out of bounds. I mean, reversing that is clearly not just a political, it's not just a question of pulling the right lever in the ballot box. It's a matter of how do you change society? How do you change people? Isn't it? I mean, I guess that's what you're trying to get at, that this is not just about politics. This is about culture. It's about a philosophy.
Yeah, I think every one of us has a responsibility to begin by making order in his or her own life. This argument, by the way, it's very much, I think, what Jordan Peterson has been saying for years in talking about the angry young men who've grown up without traditions. They have no direction. And all sorts of terrible things that happen to them personally. It's not just to society, but to them personally. And now we have Abigail Schreier's very eloquent and courageous books and essays talking about what's happening to young women. And look, I mean, I really do think that what we're talking about is we're telling young people and older people, first of all, save yourself. Save yourself by plugging back into a tradition that can offer you some kind of guidance. And I know that doesn't sound like what people are expecting to hear at this point.
And nor is it what they want to hear.
No, maybe it's not what they want to hear. But once you're pushed beyond a certain point, at this point, I don't even think that the continuation of liberalism looks like a viable alternative to people who look at this objectively. I mean, I think really what we're talking about is this woke neo-Marxism running its perpetual revolution indefinitely until it simply destroys everything that we've had. That's one option, and the other alternative is to restore and bring back a strong power that's willing and able to fight this. And the only power, the only such social power that we know is the old Christianity and Judaism. And I know a lot of the people watching this network are Jewish, and they may be surprised that I speak about Christianity and Judaism in the same breath. I know lots of Jews are uncomfortable with that, and I fully understand that. There are extremely deep differences between Christianity and Judaism, and our historic relationship with Christianity has been troubled, to say the very least. But at this point, I think we really have to be realistic. It is the Tanakh, the Bible, is the only force that is capable of withstanding this cultural revolution, and the fact that young Jews and young Christians are so distant from the Bible, and especially, Christians. A lot of Jews think that the Christians are just doing fine, and they all know the Old and New Testament as they interpret it. That isn't true. The situation in Christian communities is one where they're, to a very large extent, they're still trying to hold on to the New Testament, but the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, is something that they barely know anymore. And when you meet groups of young educated Christians, overwhelmingly they don't know the Old Testament. And let me be clear about what that means. It means that when the woke neo-Marxists attack Christianity, they attack it not on the the New Testament. They attack primarily the Old Testament. They say, look at that book that that you're supposed to believe in. It's all about the particularity of a particular family, and the selfishness of a particular family, a particular nation, this attachment to the land, corrupt morals in terms of the treatment of women, the treatment of homosexuals. It just goes on and on and on. From the perspective of today's society, the most politically incorrect text that was ever written is the Hebrew Bible, is the Old Testament. And it is in the ability to transmit the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament that Christians are failing, and their kids are leaving Christianity because of that. Now, in this context, we Jews, we have an extremely important role to play, because to the extent that we know our Bible and we know what it says, and maybe that may not be.
I think that might be a leap of faith on your part, but keep going.
Well, I
when I speak of the vast majority of American Jews, I'm not speaking of people who are observant.
We don't actually need the vast majority. I mean, what we need is brave people. We need leadership. We need people who are going to be willing to invest what needs to be invested, and to take a public posture. And that's what we don't have. I mean, obviously, it'd be really nice if all 6 million or 5 million Jews in America, if they all started keeping Shabbat, I would be very excited. If they all started learning Torah, but I don't think that's what we need. I think that what we need is a Jewish leadership which is capable of saying, there's only two choices here. There's the biblical and Jewish tradition, which is fundamentally good, even if there are things that you personally find uncomfortable. It's fundamentally good, and it fundamentally teaches us how to live. And that's something that if we were willing to say it out loud, then we could probably get Christians to say it out loud, because Christians are, you have no idea how demoralized and crushed the Christian community is in the United States at the moment. And to a very large degree, I mean, I've seen this at this point for years and years across all denominations, across many meetings of different kinds of Christian groups. They are, the Christians are thirsty, are dying to hear Jews stand up and say, look, we've been a persecuted minority. We've experienced that. We know what that's about. And we believe that what needs to happen is for this society to return to Scripture, for this society to put God and Bible back in the schools, just to pick one example, and to establish a biblical framework for political and moral life. If there are plenty of Jews who know enough to say that, but there are almost no Jews who are willing to say it. And that's got to change, and it's got to change very quickly, unless we're perfectly happy to see America overrun by neo-Marxism, with all of the implications. That's not going to just have bad implications for Christians. That will mean the end of Orthodox or traditional Judaism in America, and it could also mean the end of Israel, also possible. I just don't think there are a lot of choices here. You can see what's coming. You can see it clearly. And we do have something powerful enough to stand as an answer, but we're not fighting for it. So when does that happen?
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right that the consequences of a failure to answer this challenge are potentially catastrophic for everything. Yes, Israel as well as American society. I want to drill down before I want to later. I want to get to sort of the last part of your book when you speak of your own personal journey and about what it is to live a conservative life, which I think is very important and in some ways the most accessible as well as the most compelling part of your book. As much as I really personally enjoyed all the intellectual history, I'm not sure that might be a little heavy going for some other readers.
No, I've noticed almost everybody starts picks up the last chapter and starts reading there. It's funny.
Well, there's some people who like to read the end of books anyway. Some of us just like to go through things chronologically. But
Right.
so I went through everything else and then I got to it. But first, I want to sort of drill down on one aspect of something that you've just been explaining about the importance of putting religion back into our national life as sort of as a guidepost, as something that can help us resist the forces that are really tearing down society and sort of everything that is sort of public decency, you name it. And in one of your chapters, just before you get to your personal story, you sort of give a template for what you think conservative democracy will look like. And I think a lot of it is very powerful. We don't have time to sort of drill down through every angle. But one thing that I sort of found and I wanted to discuss with you is when you speak of the role of religion in public life and restoring the role of religion in public life, you say that what is necessary is for the religion that is sort of the religion of the majority in each country to become then the basis of sort of government, to give it sort of an anchor of morality. And you explicitly say that in the United States that means Christianity, and that it should be the basis for public life and quote unquote strongly reflected in government. Now, I think in a sort of broad sense, I think I see where you're going, and I think that's a powerful argument. But on the other hand, that also sounds awfully like establishing Christianity as the state religion in this country. And even though you explicitly say that the rights of minorities, religious minorities like Jews and others, need to be guaranteed and their autonomy should be allowed, that sounds more like toleration than equality. And sort of, and I think at one point in your book you even kind of criticized the founders for not being more explicit about putting religion into the Constitution, something you think is a mistake. They thought that it would be a mistake given the past of established religions in Europe, even though, as you quote, and frankly I like to quote John Adams' line about that the form of government that America has chosen is impossible for any but a religious people, but yet you seem to be sort of okay with a form of establishment that doesn't just scare Jews, but it would certainly seem to put us in a very different status than we currently are today.
Well, look, the history of the idea of separation of church and state in America is something that has been the subject of liberal propaganda. I'm sorry to speak so bluntly, but it's simply the case for a very long time. And so most people at this point, every time I speak before an audience, somebody begins and says separation of church and state was written into the American Constitution, and there is no truth to that at all. I mean, it's not it's not just that it's a little bit off. It's absolutely false. The doctrine of separation of constitutional separation of church and state, as we know it today, was born in the Everson versus versus Board of Education decision in 1947. And this is part of the traumatic liberal reaction to the two world wars that I talked about earlier. That beginning in 1947, the United States Supreme Court begins to impose on all 48 states, at the time 48, the idea that religion has to be something that's private and that it can't be public. Now, in 1985, Justice William Rehnquist wrote a long and important dissent from a different decision in the American Supreme Court, tracing 40 years of the destruction of public religion in the United States since the Everson decision in 1947. And he correctly argues that there's no historical justification for that decision, that it was wrongly decided and that it must be overturned. What were the founders actually thinking? Well, I think the founders were, to begin with, the founders were sharply aware that every single state in the United States at the time that the American Constitution was written either had an established church, meaning a particular denomination was the established church of that state, or had established Christianity in some more general sense. Okay, so each state was kind of an experiment in its own. Each state had its own particular ways of doing things, but the default position in the United States at the American founding was the different states have the right to determine the appropriate degree of Christian or biblical or monotheist moral and political posture within each state. And by the way, this is also inherited. People don't understand this. That this is also inherited from the English tradition, because in England, although there was one king, the Church of England was the official church only in England. In Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, the Church of Scotland, was a completely different kind of Christianity, and in Ireland, the Church of Ireland. And so the idea that different parts of Britain or different parts of the United States could have different forms or different experiments or different traditions, customs with respect to how to do church and state relations. That's an integral part of the Anglo-American tradition, and Americans have it until 1947. Of course, in the 19th.
But the states, I don't mean to, but the states
go ahead.
Abandoned their state religions within a generation of the Constitution. That wasn't a post-World War II thing. That was, I think Connecticut was the last holdout, in the 1830s or 1840s. By then, there were no state religions anywhere in the United States.
You're right that by the 1840s, official particular churches being established in American states was something that they'd given up. But let's talk about what still existed in 1947. In McCulloch in 1948, the American Supreme Court strikes down the teaching of Christianity and Judaism in Chicago public schools. That's what the case was about. Here's what they were doing. They in Chicago public schools, they had a system that allowed the students to choose between a Catholic teacher, a Protestant teacher, or a Jewish teacher. They had a requirement that the student was supposed to choose some kind of religion to study during school hours, but on the basis of conscience, you could get out of that as well. Now that to me sounds like an extremely generous and tame version of teaching religion as a central part of public life in America. Is it perfect? No. Do I think that it would be without flaws? No. But I think that kind of a posture, where Christianity and Judaism are returned to legitimate and central pillars of American life, that is the only alternative that we have, unless we want this new religion, the woke religion, to be the religion of Americans. And so in those states, in those places where there is still a Christian majority, or a pro-Christian majority, or a pro-biblical majority, I would think that sensible people who see what's coming would would put together that alliance and get to work coming up with their experiment for how to do this right. And then we'll have different experiments, and we'll see if it's, if it leads to the, to the Iran of the Ayatollahs, like the liberals keep telling us. That we'll know that pretty quickly. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think that biblical tradition, Christianity, and Judaism are the only force that has the possibility of saving America now.
Okay, well, that's a strong argument. I think the Chicago system that you speak of sounds very reasonable. I'm not sure that that's what would happen, but I think you're right that the great danger is the woke religion, which is becoming the state religion in this country. I want to ask now about your own experiences, which, as I say, is a very compelling story. You speak of as being a student, a freshman at Princeton, and meeting the woman who would become your wife, and sort of how the two of you went on your own journey, both in the world of ideas, but of also, sort of finding a faith and finding a way of life, and how that ultimately is not merely as important, but really more important for creating a society, of finding what you found. Tell us a little bit about your own experiences and how you got to this position where you are today.
Okay, sure. I should emphasize that there's no such thing as a perfect family. There's no such thing as a family that doesn't have hardship and trouble. As far as I know, there's no such thing as a marriage that doesn't have hardship and trouble, and the same thing is with relationships between parents and children. So I don't want to pretend that like I have the solution to everybody's problems, but
and you don't write as if you do, but you do write of an experience that I
yes.
think does resonate for people.
Yeah. So I as I wrote in the book, I mean, my father's second marriage was breaking up when I was in college, and my friend Julie, who we later got married towards a few years later. She was also going through. Her father had left their family when she was 2 years old, and she had suffered through some pretty terrible things. And when we met the first months of university, I think that for both of us, we understood that the only way that we could kind of break this horrific cycle of parents not being able to hold families together, and children responding to it with drugs and alcohol and abortions and violence and suicide, and ultimately, getting divorced themselves, or maybe just not getting married and not having children at all, which I think was true for a lot of my friends from high school, that they just never married or never had children. And Julie and I, we were really clear. Both of us had seen families that seemed capable and functional. In her case, it was her grandparents. Her grandparents were pious Presbyterians, and she lived in their home for a number of years during when she was in high school. And in my case, it was my aunt, my uncle Yitzchak, and my aunt Linda, who were Orthodox Jews living in a small house with 6 children in a tiny community in the Shomron, an hour north of Jerusalem. And those experiences with traditional family life, I don't think that they weren't enough to teach us how to lead a traditional family, but it was possible for both of us, from having glimpsed how other families live, how traditional families live, to understand that we were completely on the wrong course. and that if we wanted to give our children anything that was better than what it was that we had received, then we would have to be part of a tradition, a traditional community, and a traditional a project of handing down ways of life, ways of behaving, ways of thinking and understanding things, which we didn't know. And so this began. We set out to do this. In theory, we were already talking about this the first weeks we knew each other, but in practice, what happened was that Passover time came around our spring of our freshman year, and we went for a week to eat at the kosher dining hall. And once we got to the kosher dining hall, where we were surrounded by young people who knew things about Judaism and other things. I mean, just the entire community at Stevenson Hall in those days was focused on politics and philosophy and religion and arguing, crucial things about how to live, as opposed to what the rest of the campus was doing for with their spare hours, which was basically drinking. When we got to Stevenson Hall and to the student-run kosher dining hall, we decided after a week that we were never going back. And we didn't become observant Orthodox Jews overnight. Julie converted it to that was a process. She went by herself to Israel and spent a lot of time with my relatives in Israel, and then came back and started learning for conversion. And both of us, along with many other friends at Princeton at the time, we began slowly taking up Orthodox Jewish practice and Orthodox Jewish Torah study. It's something that we succeeded in, meaning we had 9 children in Israel, and to this day we live in a religious community, and look, it's just better. Jonathan, what can I tell you? It's a better life. It's been 40 years. It's just a better life. And it's not perfect, but it's better in every way, almost. And so if people actually want to conserve and to fix things in their own lives, the way to do it is to find an Orthodox Jewish community, or if you're a Christian, start with an Orthodox Christian community. Not every congregation is appropriate to every person, and so it is a search. You really need to work on finding a place where you personally can flourish and grow. But I've seen it done many, many times. I've seen it done, hundreds, thousands of times that people have done this. It's completely doable. You just have to want it.
Well, that's a powerful message, and I think one that not only has resonated with your readers, but deserves a wider audience, as well as the whole world of ideas that you're trying to open up to your readers. I want to thank you for coming on. This has been a great conversation, and we've barely scratched the surface of what you wrote. But we hope you'll come back and discuss this further at some point. Sure. And good luck with the book. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org. Let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.